The gymnasium lights hit Ethan cold like a spotlight he never asked for. And for one unbearable second, he thought every parent in the room could hear his heart slamming against his ribs. Rows of folding chairs stretched toward a stage draped in blue and gold, the school's colors bleeding into the banner that read, Westbridge High Class of 2026. Ethan sat near the aisle with his hands clenched around a bouquet of white roses, the stems damp from the way he kept squeezing them without noticing. Beside him, an empty seat waited for no one, because he had come alone, the way he always came to everything that mattered for Leo. 17 years old, and already taller than him, Leo was somewhere backstage in a cap and gown, probably fixing his tie for the 10th time, probably nervous in that quiet way he never talked about. Ethan had raised him since Leo was a toddler, ever since their mother's death turned a 22-year-old college dropout into the only parent his baby brother would ever really know. He told himself that was why his chest felt tight tonight, pride wearing the disguise of dread. He told himself that was the only reason his eyes kept drifting toward the stage where the principal would soon stand to deliver her remarks. He had no idea he was about to watch a stranger's composure shatter in real time. And he had even less idea that the shattering would belong to him just as much as it belonged to her. The principal walked out to polite applause, papers in hand, a navy blazer fitted sharp against her frame, dark hair pulled back in a knot that looked too severe for someone who couldn't have been older than 30. Ethan barely looked up at first. Principals were background noise at events like this, faces that blurred into podiums and microphones. But something made him lift his eyes anyway, some old instinct he hadn't trusted in years. And the moment he did, the woman at the podium stopped moving entirely. Her mouth had been open, mid-sentence, some line about resilience and the graduating class, and the words simply died there, hanging unfinished in the air of the gymnasium. 300 people shifted in their seats. A child somewhere near the back laughed at nothing. The principal's hand found the edge of the podium and gripped it the way a person grips something to keep from falling, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, were locked on Ethan like he was the only person left in the room. He felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. He didn't know this woman. He was certain of that the same way he was certain of his own name, and yet something about the terror on her face made his stomach drop before his mind caught up to why. "Sorry," she finally said into the microphone, her voice cracking just slightly before she cleared her throat and forced it steady again. "I lost my place for a moment. Please forgive me." The crowd offered a soft, forgiving laugh, the kind reserved for nerves on a big night, and she pushed through the rest of her speech with the practiced calm of someone who had learned long ago how to keep her voice from betraying her. But Ethan watched her hands. They trembled around the edges of her note cards for the remainder of the ceremony. And twice more, her gaze slid back toward him, quick and involuntary, like she couldn't stop herself from checking whether he was real. He sat frozen in his own chair, now roses forgotten in his lap, replaying her face over and over. He had seen that particular kind of fear only once before in his life, on the morning he'd learned his mother wasn't coming home from the hospital. It was the look of someone staring at a wound that had never actually closed. When Leo's name was finally called, Ethan stood and cheered loud enough to embarrass him, clapping until his palms stung, because whatever strange current had passed through the room a few minutes earlier didn't change the fact that his little brother had just become the first person in their family to finish high school with honors. Leo crossed the stage, grinning, diploma raised over his head like a trophy. And for a moment, Ethan forgot everything else. He forgot the principal's frozen stare. He forgot the tightness in his own chest. There was only Leo, only pride, only the promise Ethan had made at 22 that this kid would never once feel like a burden, no matter what it cost him. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and didn't care who saw. The reception afterwards spilled out into the courtyard. String lights hung between the oak trees, parents clustering around their graduates with cameras and cake. And Ethan finally caught sight of Leo weaving through the crowd toward him, gown unzipped over a wrinkled dress shirt. "You cried," Leo said, punching him lightly in the arm, grinning so wide it made him look about 10 years younger than he was. "Don't lie, I saw you," Ethan laughed, pulling him into a hug that lasted a second too long for a 17-year-old's comfort. And Leo let him have it anyway. "I'm allowed to cry," Ethan said. "I raised you basically by myself. This is my Oscar moment too." Leo rolled his eyes, but there was something soft underneath the sarcasm, something that had always existed between them, an understanding built out of years of grocery runs and parent-teacher conferences, and Ethan learning to braid hair for a school project because there was no one else to do it. It was in the middle of that laughter that Ethan felt a presence behind him, and when he turned, the principal was standing 3 feet away, her composure rebuilt, but her eyes still carrying the ghost of whatever had cracked it earlier. "Congratulations," she said to Leo. First, her voice warm, now professional. Nothing like the strangled sound from the podium. "Your grades this semester were remarkable. I hope you know how proud everyone here is of you." Leo thanked her, oblivious to the tension humming beneath her words, and wandered off toward a group of friends calling his name, leaving Ethan alone with a woman who was looking at him like he was a ghost she owed an apology to. "I'm Claire Whitmore," she said, extending a hand that wasn't quite steady. "I don't think we've officially met. I handle most things behind a desk, so I rarely get the pleasure of meeting families in person until nights like this." Ethan shook her hand, and the second their palms touched, something passed between them that felt too large for a stranger's handshake, an electricity neither of them could explain out loud in a courtyard full of cameras and cake. "Ethan Cole," he said, watching her face carefully now, searching for whatever answer might be hiding behind her eyes. "I'm Leo's brother. I raised him after our mom passed." He said it plainly, the way he always did, because it was simply the truth of his life, and he'd stopped feeling the need to soften it for other people's comfort. But something in Claire's expression flickered again at the word brother, a flash of pain so quick he almost missed it, gone before he could name it. "I didn't catch your first name during the ceremony," he added. "But I have to ask because I don't think I imagined it. You looked at me up there like you'd seen a ghost." Claire's jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked like she might simply excuse herself and vanish into the crowd the way people do when a question cuts too close to something they've spent years burying. "You just resemble someone I used to know," she said. Finally the words careful, measured, clearly not the whole truth. "It threw me off. I apologize if it seemed strange." Ethan wanted to press further, wanted to ask who, wanted to ask why her hands were still trembling slightly at her sides. But Leo was calling his name from across the courtyard, waving a group photo he wanted his brother in, and the moment slipped away before Ethan could hold on to it. He excused himself, glancing back once as he walked toward Leo, and found Claire still standing exactly where he'd left her, watching Leo laugh with his friends, with an expression that looked less like admiration and more like grief. Ethan didn't understand it yet. He wouldn't understand it for weeks. But something in his chest had already started to unravel that night. A thread pulled loose without his permission. And somewhere underneath the pride and the roses and the string lights, a question had lodged itself into him that he wouldn't be able to shake. Why did the principal of his brother's school look at Leo like she already knew exactly what he'd lost? Later that night, long after Leo had fallen asleep, with his diploma still propped against his nightstand lamp, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. turning Claire Whitmore's face over and over in his mind. He told himself it was nothing, some strange coincidence, some resemblance to an old friend she'd rather not explain to a stranger at a graduation party. But he had spent his whole adult life learning to read fear on people's faces, learning it the hard way in hospital hallways and courtrooms, and every place life had ever tried to break him. And what he'd seen in Claire's eyes tonight wasn't the fear of resemblance. It was the fear of recognition. It was the fear of a truth standing right in front of her that she had spent years hoping would never find its way back. The letter arrived 3 days after the graduation ceremony, plain and official, requesting Ethan's presence at Westbridge High to discuss what it vaguely called a matter concerning your family's enrollment records. He read it twice at his kitchen table before folding it back into its envelope, feeling a strange, low hum of dread settle into his stomach. Schools didn't usually summon guardians over enrollment paperwork months after a student had already graduated. He knew, somewhere beneath the practical part of his brain that wanted to dismiss it as bureaucratic nonsense, that this had everything to do with the woman who had frozen mid-sentence at the sight of him. He drove to the school on a gray Tuesday afternoon with his jaw set and his questions sharpened, telling himself he was simply protecting Leo's records, though the truth sat closer to his chest than that. He wanted to see her face again. He wanted to know why it had looked so much like grief. Claire's office was smaller than he expected, tucked at the end of a hallway lined with school photos and motivational posters that felt almost mocking in their cheerfulness. She stood when he walked in, smoothing the front of her blazer, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with something unspoken that had nothing to do with transcripts or graduation requirements. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her voice clipped in the careful professional register she'd used at the reception. Ethan didn't sit right away. He studied her instead. The tight set of her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting toward the framed photo on her desk before catching herself and looking away. "You didn't ask me here about paperwork," he said flatly. "So let's skip that part and get to whatever this is actually about." Claire's composure cracked at the edges just slightly, the same fracture he'd seen at the podium. She sank back into her chair as if the air had gone out of her, and for a long moment she said nothing, staring down at her hands folded on the desk. "Do you remember Clara Whitfield?" she finally asked, her voice quiet, testing the words like they might explode. Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath him. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in almost 18 years, not since he'd forced himself to stop searching for it in old photographs, stop typing it into search engines late at night when the loneliness got too loud. Clara Whitfield had been the girl he loved at 21, the one who vanished from his life without a single word of explanation, leaving behind nothing but a note that said she was sorry and a silence that had never once been filled. "That's not possible," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing as recognition began clawing its way up through years of buried memory. "Clara left the country. She married someone else. I heard that from her own mother." Claire's eyes glistened, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked less like a principal and more like the 20-year-old girl he remembered from a cramped dorm room a lifetime ago. "Clara Whitfield doesn't exist anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I changed my name after I left. I became Claire Whitmore because I couldn't bear to keep carrying a name that reminded me of everything I lost." Ethan sat down heavily in the chair he'd refused only moments earlier, his hands gripping the armrests as the room seemed to narrow around him. He had spent years constructing a version of the past that let him survive it, a version where Clara had simply grown tired of him, where she'd chosen money and comfort over a broke college kid raising his baby brother alone. He had built an entire identity around that betrayal, had let it harden something inside him that never quite softened again. And now she was sitting 3 feet away, older, sharper around the edges, telling him none of it had been the way he remembered. "You left," he said, and the anger in his voice surprised even him, raw and immediate, despite the years that should have dulled it. "You left without a word, Clara. I waited for you outside our apartment for 6 hours. 6 hours because I thought something had happened to you, because I thought you'd been hurt. And then your mother told me you'd run off with some rich family's son, that you'd chosen a better life over me." Claire flinched like he'd struck her, tears finally spilling over despite the effort in her jaw to hold them back. "That's not what happened," she said, her voice breaking now, all pretense of professionalism gone. "Your mother came to me, Ethan, 2 weeks before I left. She told me if I didn't disappear, she'd make sure you lost everything. Your scholarship, your apartment, everything you'd built to keep Leo safe after your father walked out. She said I was a distraction you couldn't afford. And she was right about one thing. I couldn't give you stability. I was 20 years old with nothing to my name. So I left because I believed her when she said it was the only way to protect you both." The words landed like something physical, knocking the air out of him in a way he hadn't expected. He thought of his mother, gone 8 years now, remembered her sharp tongue and her fierce, sometimes frightening determination to control every corner of her sons' lives. He wanted to call Claire a liar. He wanted to stand up and walk out and never think about any of this again. But some old, unwelcome instinct told him she wasn't lying, that the tremor in her voice was too specific, too detailed, too painful to be an invention. "Why didn't you come back?" he asked instead, quieter now, some of the anger draining into something closer to exhaustion. "After she died, after everything, you could have found me." Claire wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so achingly familiar it made something twist painfully in Ethan's chest. A memory of a girl who used to wipe away tears the exact same way after late-night arguments about nothing at all. "I tried once," she said. "I came back to the city 2 years after I left. I stood outside your building for almost an hour before I lost my nerve. And then I saw you through the window holding a baby, and I thought you'd moved on, started a family, built the life I always hoped you'd have. I didn't want to be the thing that ruined it." Ethan's stomach turned to ice. "That was Leo," he said slowly, watching her face carefully now. "That baby was Leo. Our mother died giving birth to him when I was 22. I raised him. He's not my son, Clara. He's my brother." The color drained visibly from Claire's face, and for a long, terrible moment she looked like she might be sick. Her hands trembled against the desk, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something barely audible. "Your mother told me she was pregnant when I left," she whispered. "She said it was your father's child, born late in her life. A surprise." "I never once thought to question the timeline. I never thought—" She stopped herself abruptly, pressing her fingers to her lips as though she could physically hold back whatever sentence had almost escaped. Ethan felt something cold slide down his spine, an instinct he couldn't yet name gathering weight in the pit of his stomach. "Finish that sentence," he said, his voice low and urgent now, all traces of old anger replaced by something closer to fear. Claire shook her head rapidly, standing up from her desk and moving toward the window, putting distance between them, as though physical space might undo whatever she'd almost revealed. "It's nothing," she said too quickly, her voice thin and unconvincing. "I'm sorry I misspoke. This is a lot to process for both of us, and I think I need some time before we continue this conversation." Ethan stood too, crossing the small office until he was close enough to see the way her hands were shaking against the windowsill. "You don't get to almost say something like that and then walk it back," he said, gentler now, despite the urgency thrumming beneath his ribs. "Whatever it is, I need to hear it. Please." Claire turned to face him, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to collapse entirely, the principal disappearing, and the girl he used to love standing in her place, frightened and cornered, and carrying something heavier than either of them could fully understand yet. "I need proof before I say anything else," she said finally, her voice steadying with visible effort. "I could be wrong. I probably am wrong. It was a coincidence in timing, nothing more. And I don't want to hand you a suspicion that could tear your family apart over nothing." Ethan wanted to push harder, wanted to demand the truth right there in that cramped office with its cheerful posters and its framed photograph he still hadn't been allowed to see clearly. But something in her expression, some flicker of genuine terror beneath the composure, told him pushing wouldn't get him anywhere tonight. "This isn't over," he said instead, stepping back toward the door. "I need to understand what my mother did. And I think you know more than you're telling me." He left her office with his pulse hammering and his mind spinning through years of half-remembered details. Small, strange inconsistencies he'd never examined too closely because he'd had no reason to. He thought of the way his mother had insisted on handling every detail of Leo's birth certificate herself, refusing help from anyone, even Ethan. He thought of the way she'd moved them across the state within months of Leo's birth, citing a fresh start, though she'd never explained why. He thought of the housekeeper, Marta, who had worked for his mother for over a decade and who always went quiet whenever anyone brought up Leo's early childhood, her eyes sliding away like she was protecting something she'd sworn never to speak of. None of it had ever seemed suspicious before, because he'd had no reason to look for a lie. Now every memory felt like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. That night, Ethan sat across the dinner table from Leo, watching him laugh about some inside joke from his friend group, watching the easy, familiar rhythm of a relationship built on nearly 2 decades of shared mornings and late nights and every ordinary moment in between. He studied Leo's face in a way he never had before, searching for traces of their mother in his features, searching for anything that might confirm or deny the terrifying possibility beginning to take root in his mind. He saw dark hair like his own, yes, but also something else. Something in the shape of Leo's eyes and the particular tilt of his smile that Ethan had never quite been able to place. Something that suddenly felt less like a family resemblance and more like an inheritance he hadn't been told about. He accused himself to the kitchen under the pretense of getting more water, gripping the edge of the counter, breathing hard against a truth he wasn't ready to name, but could no longer fully ignore. Whatever Claire had almost said in that office, whatever secret was buried inside his mother's careful lies, Ethan understood now that his entire life with Leo, the one thing he'd always been certain of, might not be the story he thought it was. Marta had worked in the Cole household for 11 years, long enough to know which floorboards creaked and which questions were better left unanswered. And when Ethan found her in the laundry room folding towels on a quiet Thursday afternoon, he could see in the stiffening of her shoulders that she already sensed what he'd come to ask. He'd rehearsed the question a dozen times in the car, trying to make it sound casual, offhand, the kind of thing a person asks out of idle curiosity rather than desperation. But the moment he opened his mouth, all pretense fell away. "Marta, I need you to tell me the truth about Leo's birth," he said, watching her hands go still over a folded towel. "Something isn't adding up, and I think you know what it is." She didn't turn around right away. She stood there for a long moment, her back to him, the hum of the dryer filling the silence between them. And when she finally faced him, her eyes were wet and heavy with years of guilt she'd clearly been carrying alone. "I promised your mother I would never speak of it," she said quietly. "But I've watched you raise that boy like your own son for 17 years. And I think you deserve better than a woman's promise made to protect the wrong person," she told him haltingly, piecing together fragments she'd witnessed rather than a full confession, because Ethan's mother had never trusted anyone completely, not even the woman who'd spent over a decade in her home. She remembered a young woman brought quietly into the house nearly 9 months before Leo's birth, a woman his mother introduced only as a distant cousin needing a place to stay, a woman who disappeared just as quietly weeks after giving birth, never to be spoken of again. She remembered his mother forging paperwork with a lawyer she paid in cash, remembered whispered arguments behind closed doors about protecting the family name, about a scandal that would ruin everything if certain people ever found out. She didn't know the young woman's real name. She'd never been told, and she'd learned early in her employment that asking questions in that house only invited consequences she couldn't afford. But she remembered the woman's face, thin and frightened, dark hair, and eyes that carried the same shape Ethan had started noticing in Leo's face just days earlier. "I always wondered," Marta admitted, wiping her eyes with the corner of a dish towel. "But it wasn't my place to wonder out loud. I needed this job. I needed the money you paid me to help raise that boy. I'm sorry, Ethan. I should have said something years ago." Ethan drove to the school that same afternoon without calling ahead, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his mind a storm of half-formed accusations he didn't yet have the right words for. He found Claire in the courtyard, supervising a student council event, laughing at something one of the students said. Her guard lowered in a way he hadn't seen since the reception. She caught sight of him across the yard, and her smile faded instantly, replaced by the same careful wariness that had defined every conversation between them since graduation night. "We need to talk," he said, and she nodded once, excusing herself to a colleague before leading him to a quiet bench beneath one of the oak trees, far enough from the students that their conversation wouldn't be overheard. He told her what Marta had said, watching her face carefully as each detail landed, watching the color slowly drain from her cheeks until she looked almost translucent in the afternoon light. "A distant cousin," Claire repeated softly, her voice trembling. "Brought into the house before Leo's birth, gone weeks after. Ethan, that's exactly when I disappeared. That's exactly when your mother told me I was pregnant with your father's surprise child. Except I was the one who was pregnant. With your child." The words hung between them heavier than anything either of them had said aloud before, and Ethan felt the ground shift permanently beneath him. Every assumption he'd built his adult life on, crumbling into something unrecognizable. "You're saying Leo is—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't force the words out of his mouth, because saying them meant accepting a truth that would rewrite 17 years of his life in an instant. Claire reached for his hand without thinking, an old instinct resurfacing from a decade and a half ago, and for once, he didn't pull away. "I don't know for certain," she said carefully. "I want to be wrong. I want there to be some other explanation, but I can't ignore this anymore, and neither can you." They agreed in the quiet urgency of that conversation not to say anything to Leo until they had real proof, not suspicion built on a housekeeper's memory and painful coincidence. But agreeing not to disrupt Leo's life didn't stop either of them from watching him more closely in the weeks that followed. And it didn't stop Claire from finding small, careful ways to spend time with him under the guise of mentorship, offering to help him prepare college application essays, inviting him to volunteer at school events where she could observe him without raising suspicion. Ethan watched this unfold with a strange, aching tenderness, watching Claire lean over Leo's shoulder to correct a sentence in his essay, watching the exact same tilt of concentration cross both their faces at once, a mirrored expression he'd apparently missed for 17 years, simply because he'd had no reason to look for it. Leo, oblivious to the storm swirling quietly around him, seemed to genuinely enjoy Claire's company, drawn to her calm patience in a way that surprised even him. "Principal Whitmore is actually pretty cool," he told Ethan one evening over dinner, shrugging like the observation meant nothing. "She doesn't talk to me like I'm a kid. She actually listens." Ethan smiled and said nothing, his chest tight with a secret he wasn't ready to carry alone anymore. It was during one of these overlapping evenings, when Claire stayed late helping Leo revise a scholarship essay in the school library, that Ethan arrived to pick his brother up and found himself waiting in the hallway outside, watching through the glass door as the two of them worked side by side. Leo laughed at something Claire said, tilting his head back exactly the way she did when she laughed, an unconscious mirror neither of them could have noticed in themselves. Ethan's throat tightened, watching it, grief and hope tangled together in a way he didn't have language for yet. When Leo finally gathered his things and headed for the car, Claire lingered behind, and Ethan found himself staying too. The two of them alone in the quiet hallway, with 17 years of unspoken history hanging in the space between them. "He has your laugh," Ethan said quietly, the first soft thing he'd said to her since their reunion. "I never noticed until tonight. I don't know how I missed it for so long." Claire's eyes filled with tears again, though this time they seemed to carry something closer to wonder than grief. "I've been afraid to hope," she admitted. "For years I told myself it was easier not to imagine what I lost. Easier to bury it than to spend my life wondering what could have been." Ethan studied her in the dim hallway light, seeing not just the girl he'd loved at 21, but the woman she'd become. Someone who had built an entire career shaping young lives while quietly grieving the one she believed she'd never get to know. He thought of his own anger, carried for 18 years like armor, built on a lie his mother had constructed with terrifying precision. He thought of every birthday he'd celebrated with Leo, every school project, every late night spent worrying over a fever or a broken heart. All of it built on a truth he was never given the chance to understand. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to surface so plainly. "I spent years hating you for something you never did. I let my mother's lie become the story I told myself about you, and I never once questioned it." Claire shook her head, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek. "You didn't know," she said. "Neither of us knew. Your mother made sure of that, and I think she believed until the day she died that she was protecting something worth protecting, even if it cost both of us everything that mattered." They stood there for a long moment, not quite touching, not quite closing the distance that 18 years and one devastating lie had carved between them. But something had shifted nonetheless. Some fragile understanding settling into place where resentment used to live. Outside in the parking lot, Leo leaned against Ethan's car, scrolling through his phone, utterly unaware that inside the school building, his brother and his principal were quietly rebuilding the wreckage of a love neither of them had ever fully let go of. Ethan knew, standing there in that empty hallway, that the fragile peace between them wouldn't last much longer. The truth was coming whether they were ready for it or not, and once it arrived, there would be no version of their lives that looked the way it had before. But for the first time since graduation night, he found himself hoping that whatever came next might be worth the pain required to get there, both for himself and for the boy who had no idea his entire world was quietly, carefully, about to change. The call came at 11 at night, sharp and jarring against the quiet of Ethan's apartment. And by the time he understood the words on the other end of the line, he was already grabbing his keys and running for the door. Leo had collapsed during a late basketball practice with friends, complaining of chest pain and dizziness before losing consciousness entirely. And the voice on the phone belonged to a paramedic asking Ethan to meet them at St. Andrew's Memorial as quickly as possible. He drove faster than he'd ever driven in his life, his hands shaking against the wheel, his mind refusing to settle on any single thought except Leo's face, pale and still, being lifted onto a stretcher. He called Claire from a red light he barely remembered stopping at, his voice cracking as he told her what little he knew. And she was already pulling on her coat before he finished the sentence, promising to meet him there in 15 minutes, though it felt like an eternity to both of them. The emergency room swallowed him whole the moment he arrived. Fluorescent lights and clipped voices, and the particular sterile smell of fear that clings to hospital hallways. A doctor met him near the nurse's station, young but steady, explaining that Leo had suffered what appeared to be a sudden cardiac event, rare but not unheard of in teenagers, something that required immediate testing to rule out an underlying genetic condition. "We need a full medical history," the doctor said, flipping through a chart that felt thin and inadequate in Ethan's shaking hands. "Any family history of heart conditions, blood disorders, anything at all that might help us understand what triggered this?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer and found nothing there. No real answer, because everything he thought he knew about Leo's family history had just spent the last month unraveling in front of him. "I don't know," he admitted, the words scraping out of him like broken glass. "I don't actually know his real family history. I think there's something you need to understand about our situation." Claire arrived moments later, breathless, her hair still damp from a shower interrupted mid-rinse, and the doctor's eyes moved between the two of them with growing confusion as Ethan tried to explain, haltingly, the impossible situation neither of them had proof of yet. "We believe Leo might not be my biological brother," Ethan said finally, forcing the words out into the harsh hospital light. "We believe he might be my son, mine and hers. There was a cover-up years ago involving my mother, and we've had no way to confirm it until now." The doctor's expression shifted from confusion to careful understanding, the kind reserved for situations too complicated to question in the middle of a medical emergency. "Given the cardiac concern, a genetic panel would actually help us significantly, regardless of the family situation," she said. "We can run a paternity comparison alongside the cardiac workup. It might take a few hours, but it will give us real answers, medically and otherwise." Ethan nodded, unable to speak, and sank into a plastic chair in the waiting room beside Claire, both of them staring at the double doors that had swallowed Leo an hour earlier, praying for a version of the truth that didn't come wrapped in tragedy. The waiting stretched unbearably, minutes bleeding into hours. The two of them sitting in silence, broken only by the distant beeping of machines and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes against linoleum. Ethan thought of every argument he'd ever had with his mother about Leo's upbringing, every strange insistence she'd made about handling certain paperwork herself, every unexplained decision that had once seemed like simple overprotectiveness and now felt like the calculated moves of a woman terrified of being caught. He thought of the storage unit in the city, the one his mother had rented under a false name that he'd only discovered after her funeral, filled with boxes he'd never had the heart to sort through. Somewhere in the chaos of his fear for Leo, a memory surfaced with sudden, sharp clarity. "There's a storage unit," he said abruptly, turning to Claire. "My mother rented it years ago. I never went through everything. There might be answers there, papers, something that could explain all of this properly instead of just guessing." Claire grabbed his hand, her grip fierce and grounding. "Then we'll go through it," she said. "Together. Whatever it takes to understand what she did to us." 2 hours later, the doctor returned with an expression that told them everything before she even spoke. Careful and measured, the particular calm doctors use when delivering news that will alter a family forever. "Leo is stable," she said first, and Ethan felt his whole body sag with relief, tears springing unbidden to his eyes. "The cardiac event appears to be a mild arrhythmia, treatable and manageable long-term, nothing immediately life-threatening now that we've stabilized him. But I do have the results from the genetic panel." She paused, glancing between them with something like sympathy. "Leo is not a biological match for the parents listed on his birth certificate. Based on the comparison samples you both provided, the probability that he is your biological son, Mr. Cole, and yours, Miss Whitmore, is over 99%. The words landed exactly as devastating and exactly as inevitable as Ethan had feared they would. And beside him, Claire made a small, broken sound, half sob and half laugh. 17 years of buried grief and stolen hope finally breaking loose all at once. Ethan reached for her without thinking, and she collapsed against his shoulder, both of them holding on to something that felt too fragile and too enormous to fully comprehend in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning. They were allowed to see Leo an hour later, still groggy from sedation, but conscious, blinking up at them with confusion when he saw both his brother and his principal standing at his bedside, hands still linked in a way that clearly registered as strange even through the haze of medication. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice thin and rough. "Why do you two look like that?" Ethan sat carefully on the edge of the bed, searching for words he'd never had to find before. Words that would rewrite the entire foundation of the only family Leo had ever known. "We need to tell you something important," he said gently. "And I need you to know that no matter what I say next, nothing about how much I love you has ever changed or will ever change." Leo's eyes moved warily between them, some instinct already sensing the gravity of what was coming, and Ethan took a slow breath before finally speaking the truth aloud for the first time. "You're not my brother, Leo. You're my son. Claire is your biological mother. Our mom, our grandmother. She arranged everything years ago to hide it, and neither Claire nor I knew the truth until a few weeks ago." The silence that followed stretched long and unbearable. Leo's face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something rawer underneath. Something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "You're telling me this now?" he finally said, his voice cracking. "After I almost died in an ambulance. You couldn't have told me before this?" Ethan felt the accusation land exactly where it was meant to. Guilt settling heavy and immediate in his chest. "We didn't have proof," he said. "We suspected, but we didn't want to upend your entire life on suspicion alone. We were trying to protect you." Leo turned his head away, staring at the ceiling, tears slipping silently down his temples. "Everyone keeps trying to protect me by lying to me," he said bitterly. "Grandma lied. You didn't tell me the truth the second you knew. Even she," he gestured weakly toward Claire, "spent weeks being nice to me at school without saying a word about who she actually was." Claire stepped closer, her own eyes wet, her voice trembling but steady. "You're right to be angry," she said. "I don't have an excuse that will make this feel fair. All I can tell you is that I have spent 17 years wondering what I lost. And being near you these past weeks, even without saying the truth, has been the closest thing to peace I felt in almost 2 decades. I'm sorry it took a hospital bed for you to finally hear it from us honestly." 2 days after Leo was discharged, still processing the wreckage of everything he'd learned, Ethan finally forced himself into the storage unit his mother had left behind. Claire beside him for support, neither of them fully admitted needing. Beneath years of accumulated furniture and old files, they found a single sealed envelope tucked inside a locked metal box. His mother's handwriting unmistakable across the front. Ethan's hands shook as he opened it, and inside, in careful, deliberate script his mother had written, a confession she'd apparently never found the courage to deliver in person. She wrote of a family debt buried in silence for a generation, an arrangement with a business partner that would have destroyed everything the Cole family had built if word ever spread that her son had fathered a child with a young woman from what she coldly called an unsuitable background. She wrote of threatening Claire, of forging documents with a lawyer paid in cash, of convincing herself, in the twisted logic of fear and pride, that erasing the truth was an act of protection rather than cruelty. The final lines of the letter, dated only months before her death, read simply that she hoped one day the truth would find its way out safely when the family no longer had anything left to lose by it being known. Ethan sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, holding the letter, feeling something between fury and grief tangled together in his chest. Anger at a woman who could no longer answer for what she'd done, and a strange, unwelcome grain of understanding for the fear that had driven her to it. Claire knelt beside him, reading the letter over his shoulder, her own tears falling freely now. 17 years of unanswered questions, finally given shape and reason, however painful that reason turned out to be. She was afraid, Claire said softly. Not evil, just afraid and willing to hurt both of us to protect something that mattered less than either of us ever did. Ethan folded the letter carefully, his hands finally steady for the first time in days. It doesn't excuse it, he said. But at least now we know. At least now Leo can know the whole truth, not just the parts that hurt the most. Claire reached for his hand again, and this time, neither of them let go. Two people bound together by grief, betrayal, and a stolen truth, finally brought into the light. Standing at the edge of a decision that would determine not just their own future, but the fragile trust they now had to earn back from the son they had both, in different ways, spent his entire life loving. From a distance they never should have had to endure. 2 weeks passed before Leo spoke more than a handful of words to either of them, and Ethan spent every one of those days learning a new, humbling kind of patience, the kind that came from understanding he had no right to demand forgiveness on any timeline but his son's own. He kept showing up anyway, kept making dinner, even when Leo ate in his room, kept leaving the door to conversation open, even when it went unanswered, because he remembered what it felt like as a boy to lose a parent and be handed grief with no instructions. And he refused to let Leo navigate this alone the way he once had to. Claire, for her part, didn't push either. She sent occasional texts, small and undemanding, a photo of a book she thought he might like, a note wishing him well before a checkup with his new cardiologist, never asking for anything in return, beyond the simple right to exist quietly at the edges of his life, until he was ready to let her closer. It was Leo himself who finally broke the silence, appearing in the kitchen doorway one evening while Ethan stood at the stove, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the way that had become so familiar over the past 2 weeks. "I looked it up," Leo said without preamble, and Ethan turned down the burner, giving him his full attention. "The company, Grandma's business partner, the debt she mentioned in that letter. I found old news articles about it. It was real. She wasn't lying about that part, at least." Ethan nodded slowly, unsure where this was going, unwilling to interrupt whatever process Leo was working through in his own time. "It doesn't make what she did okay," Leo continued, his voice tight. But I keep thinking about how scared she must have been to do something that messed up because she was scared of losing everything. I don't forgive her. I don't think I want to. But I think I understand her a little more than I want to admit. Ethan crossed the kitchen and pulled his son into a hug, relieved when Leo didn't pull away this time, when he let himself be held the way he used to, when he was small, and scraped his knees, and needed someone bigger than himself to make the hurt smaller. You don't have to forgive anyone on any timeline but your own, Ethan said quietly. Not her, not me, not Claire. But I'm really proud of you for trying to understand instead of just carrying the anger alone. The following weekend, Leo asked almost shyly if Claire might want to have dinner with them. A request so small and so enormous at the same time that Ethan felt his throat tighten as he relayed the invitation. Claire arrived at the apartment carrying a homemade pie, nervous in a way that reminded Ethan achingly of the girl she used to be, standing at his old dorm room door with something baked and something to prove. Dinner started stiff and careful, all three of them navigating a conversation with no map to follow. But somewhere between the main course and dessert, Leo asked Claire an offhand question about her own childhood. And something in her answer, self-deprecating and warm, made him laugh for the first time in weeks. The tension in the room loosened slightly after that. Not fully, not completely, but enough that by the end of the evening, Leo walked Claire to her car and stood talking with her for nearly 20 minutes while Ethan watched from the window, his chest full of something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time. Something dangerously close to hope. It was Ethan's uncle, his mother's younger brother, and the executor of what remained of the family's business interests, who forced the next confrontation. Arriving unannounced at Ethan's apartment 3 weeks later, with a folder of legal documents and an expression of barely restrained anger. You're threatening to blow apart everything your mother spent her life protecting, his uncle said, dropping the folder onto the kitchen table without invitation. If word gets out that the Cole family falsified a birth certificate, covered up a paternity scandal, paid off a lawyer under the table, it won't just embarrass us. It could unravel decades of business relationships built on trust and reputation. Is that really worth it, Ethan? Digging up your mother's grave for a truth that could destroy what little stability this family has left? Ethan felt old anger rise in him, sharper now than it had been in weeks, because he recognized in his uncle's words the exact same reasoning his mother had used to justify tearing two families apart. The stability you're talking about was built on a lie that stole 17 years from my son and from the woman I loved, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fury underneath it. I'm not interested in protecting a reputation built on that kind of cruelty. If the company can't survive the truth, then maybe it was never as stable as you think it is. His uncle's expression hardened, and he laid out with clinical precision exactly what Ethan stood to lose if the truth became public in any official capacity, a portion of the family trust tied to conditions of discretion, business partnerships that had been cultivated over decades of careful image management, a lawsuit threat dressed up as concern for the family's collective well-being. Ethan listened to all of it without flinching, weighing the cost against everything he'd already decided he valued more. And when his uncle finished, Ethan simply said, "Then take the trust. Take whatever you need to take. I'd rather raise my son with the truth and nothing else than keep a fortune built on a lie that hurt him." His uncle left angry and unconvinced that Ethan understood what he was giving up. But Ethan felt lighter than he had in years, walking him to the door, unburdened by an inheritance he'd never actually wanted, at this cost. He called Claire that night to tell her what happened, and her voice on the phone was quiet, careful, testing whether he truly meant what he'd done. "You didn't have to give all of that up for us," she said. I know how much that inheritance would have meant for Leo's future, for stability. Ethan smiled into the phone, feeling more certain of this decision than almost anything else in his life. Leo's future doesn't need a fortune built on secrets, he said. It needs two parents who chose honesty over comfort. That's worth more than any trust fund could ever be. The formal legal process of correcting Leo's birth certificate took months, careful and complicated, requiring lawyers and paperwork, and more than one uncomfortable meeting with officials who clearly weren't used to a case quite this unusual. Through all of it, Leo remained remarkably steady, occasionally frustrated by the slowness of bureaucracy, but never again doubting the sincerity of either parent working through it alongside him. He began spending more time with Claire outside of school hours, now that she had resigned from her position as principal to avoid any conflict of interest, taking a role instead at the district office, where she could still shape education policy without the complication of directly overseeing her own son. Their relationship built slowly, carefully, the way any relationship between a mother and a nearly grown son might, full of small moments rather than grand gestures. A shared love of old mystery novels, discovered almost by accident. A Saturday morning spent teaching him to make the same lemon cake her own mother used to make. Small threads of connection, weaving themselves patiently into something that felt increasingly like family. Ethan and Claire's own relationship rebuilt itself with equal caution, both of them wary of rushing into something neither had fully processed the loss of the first time around. They spent long evenings after Leo went to sleep, sometimes talking, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence on Ethan's small balcony, relearning each other as the people they'd become, rather than the people they used to be. I used to imagine what it would feel like to see you again, Claire admitted one evening, wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill, her eyes fixed on the city lights spread out below them. In my imagination, it was always some perfect romantic moment. I never imagined it would look like this, messy and painful, and complicated by everything we lost. Ethan reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. I think this is better than the version you imagined, he said quietly. Because this version is real. It survived 17 years of lies and grief and one really terrifying night in a hospital, and it's still standing. That has to count for something. 6 months after that hospital night, on a crisp evening in early spring, Ethan stood in the kitchen watching Leo help Claire set the table for a birthday dinner, the three of them finally settling into something that resembled an ordinary family rhythm. Easy laughter filling a space that had once felt too fragile to hold any joy at all. Leo had grown taller, still, more confident, more willing to ask hard questions and trust that the answers, however difficult, would be given honestly this time. He'd been accepted to college with a scholarship that had nothing to do with his family's old money, and everything to do with his own hard work. A fact he was fiercely, quietly proud of. Watching him laugh at something Claire said, watching the easy warmth that had grown between them over months of careful rebuilding, Ethan felt something settle deep inside his chest. A peace he hadn't known he was capable of feeling, after everything the past year had put them through. Later that night, after Leo had gone to bed and the apartment had gone quiet around them, Ethan found Claire standing on the balcony again, the same spot where so many of their most honest conversations had taken place over the past months. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, watching the city lights flicker below in comfortable silence, for a long moment before either of them spoke. I keep thinking about that letter your mother left, Claire said eventually. About hoping the truth would find its way out safely when the family had nothing left to lose. I think about how much time we wasted because she was too afraid to say it herself while she was still alive. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer against the evening chill. "We can't get that time back," he said. "But I think we've built something worth having anyway. Something that might not have existed if we hadn't gone through all of it first." Claire turned to look at him, her eyes soft in the dim light. 17 years of grief finally settled into something gentler, something closer to gratitude than sorrow. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying none of the fear or hesitation that had marked every conversation between them since graduation night. "I loved you then, and somehow, impossibly, I love you even more now, knowing everything it cost us to find our way back here." Ethan felt something in his chest release entirely, a weight he'd carried for 18 years finally setting down for good. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion he no longer felt the need to hide. "And I'm not interested in wasting one more day pretending otherwise." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that carried the weight of everything they'd survived to get there. Every year of grief and every ounce of hard-won trust rebuilt between two people who had once lost everything to a lie and found their way back to each other anyway. Below them, the city hummed on, indifferent to the quiet miracle unfolding on a small apartment balcony. Two broken families finally becoming one whole. One built not on secrets or fear, but on the simple, hard-fought truth that some loves are worth every year it takes to find your way back to them. In the months that followed, Ethan asked Claire to marry him on a quiet Sunday morning in the same courtyard where they had first truly spoken as strangers who used to be everything to each other, kneeling beneath the same oak tree that had witnessed the beginning of their reconciliation. Leo stood nearby, no longer a boy caught between two confusing worlds, but a young man watching his parents choose each other freely, without the shadow of old lies hanging over the decision. When Claire said yes, tears streaming freely down her face, Leo was the first to hug them both, laughing through his own tears. Finally fully at peace with the family that had cost them all so much to build. Honestly, Ethan thought, watching his son embrace the woman who had given him life and the family he'd fought so hard to protect, that his mother's fear-driven cruelty had ultimately failed to accomplish the one thing she'd wanted most: keeping the family whole. Instead, it had taken the truth, painful and unavoidable, to finally give all three of them the family they deserved. Built not on secrets, but on the courage it took to face everything they'd lost and choose deliberately and completely to love each other anyway.